A little bit ago, we got new Bioshock 4 news. Well, bad news, of course. We learned that the prototype that the current team brought to higher ups was entirely destroyed. Like super shat on, a bunch of people got let off from the company, and the game got delayed. After seeing this news, it got me starting to think, whatever happened to Judas? I feel like a couple years ago, about I think it was 2 or so, we got its reveal trailer, and I think Jeff Keighley sat down with Ken Levine, the creator of Bioshock and Judas, talked for like an hour. I feel like other creators also got to play it and they gave their thoughts, and then suddenly it's been radio silent ever since. I decided to do a little digging and I found this tweet from Ken Levine. The tweet says, "Just wanted to say to all the nice folk in the industry, we are very much in hiring mode for Judas." And then a link to Ghost Story Games, Ken Levine's new studio, the careers page for people to get hired on. This immediately raises some red flags. First off, that the game is probably not anywhere near completion. Certainly, we passed I think it was March 2025 was the initial release date that was projected for the game. So obviously the title of the video is what's happening with Judas, where is it, what's going on? And obviously, minus this tweet here, we don't know too much, but if we look back at Ken Levine's previous game, Bioshock Infinite's development history, I think we get a pretty clear idea on how it's been going and sort of the troubles the team is currently facing in trying to get this game out the door. While I actually have a video, you can check out right here, that goes into way more depth on Bioshock Infinite's development history, here's a quick, brief rundown, hitting some of the key points that we need to talk about for the video. The first is that the development team kind of had free reign for a while, with being able to essentially move at their own pace, having sort of almost unlimited funds and time for what they needed. This eventually caused the game to go through roughly 3 known phases. We've got the original from the gameplay we've seen with the Gibson girl. There's the 2010 gameplay footage. And then finally the 2011 gameplay footage, which ends up actually looking kind of close to what the final game would look like. To kind of reel in together sort of how the game development went through these different phases, and how this all relates to Judas, I'm going to bring our attention over to a fantastic Polygon article called "The Final Years of Irrational Games According to Those Who Were There." The article starts off talking about how Ken Levine and the other studio at Rational Games wanted to make something bigger, grander, sort of more memorable and important compared to what they made before. Even mentions what I mentioned about how money and time weren't a concern for production in the first few years. At first, they had even worked on a couple multiplayer modes that by, I think it was roughly 2011-ish, ended up getting entirely canned despite being pretty far in development. While they were working on these multiplayer modes, reportedly the early years of development were fueled by Levine's iteration process. A feverish ability to think, create, edit, trash, and rethink ideas in search of the best possible result. The method had proven results. Sources that worked there described their former boss as someone with an ability to polish a mid-level game into a high-level one. Someone who knew what critics and shooter fans wanted, and could finagle a way to please both parties. They also pointed to Levine's eagerness to iterate as his most brilliant and most frustrating quality. It's an expensive and time-consuming creative method, but, at its best, it could produce astonishing results. Former employees say it sometimes brought people to the company, and other times drove them away. I'm sure I don't need to mention this, but you can probably start connecting the dots on how Judas has taken essentially so long. The game's been in production, I think, since 2014, whenever the end of Burial at Sea happened. You can also probably see why they're still currently hiring. I know that there's plenty of people that left Irrational Games with Ken Levine, and that they're not working at Ghost Story Games anymore. One source recalls how Levine would challenge the historical accuracy of a design down to the tiniest of details. If something wasn't perfect, if it didn't fit in the context of the world, then it needed to be done again. This process had resulted in stacks of incredible work, including things like the skyline, the main mode of transportation in Bioshock Infinite, that would be praised upon the game's release. That process, however, meant every aspect of the game, including its fundamental tenets, could be reworked over and over, to a point that entire chunks of Infinite's design had yet to be locked years into its development. Sounds pretty rough, right? But I hope that what I've just said there has given you a good idea on sort of what the developers of Judas have likely been going through. But I've got a little bit more. In 2012, about a year or so before the final game's release, the game was nowhere near in a state of being completed. So they actually had to bring in outside people to help sort of put the game back on track, kind of reel Ken Levine in, add some real datelines, and being able to say, hey, this is good enough, we're going to keep this in, and let's move on to the next stuff. One of these was Jordan Thomas, who, upon being brought in, decided that multiplayer wasn't practical for the final game and ended up having it cut. The general way that Jordan Thomas and Ken Levine worked was that Thomas would help essentially put Ken Levine's ideas into paper. Thomas was described as someone who could take the many ideas and projects in progress and organize them into one vision. He could snap the studio out of the iterative cycle by creating a map toward realizing the idea in Levine's head. The other big hire that was brought on was Rod Ferguson, who was actually just recently announced to be on the team for BioShock 4, which, personally, for me as a big BioShock fan, totally feels relieving, and like we're probably actually going to get a good product now. Before I was excited for it, but I was kind of like, well, if it's not like Ken Levine and they're kind of creating their own thing, I'm not sure if it'll be something super good. But with somebody who has experience with my personal favorite game, I feel way better about it. But back to BioShock Infinite's development. Many former employees believe Irrational would not have shipped BioShock Infinite without Ferguson. As VP of Development, Ferguson served as the practical, metrics-minded foil to Levine's creative method, and according to sources, Levine benefited from this structure and deadline. Every day he sent the team a bug count and a list of actionable items. Then he'd meet with leads and directors in what a source calls the shit chamber, a place where senior employees could get together and share information face to face. Rod was there to turn the lights on and to turn them off. With Rod Ferguson's support, the team found its momentum. With all that said, hopefully you've got a good idea on sort of what's going on with Judas. So initially, back in 2014, Ken Levine had he did like a big, what is it, TED Talk, I guess is a nice way of putting it, about building block Legos for narrative, and that this would come into play with his next game. And I think a big part of why Judas has taken so long in itself to even be revealed is probably because he kept making different versions of this, and not liking it didn't fully fit his iteration, taking apart pieces and not everything worked until eventually he found something that started to work. He likely had the same process with pretty much every other aspect of the game, probably down to gameplay, gunplay, the world itself, how you interact with it, how the characters interact with you. Just all these little things being presented to him and then sort of being able to nitpick in little bits until everything sort of worked perfectly. Eventually, this likely led into the gameplay reveal trailer that we got and all of the extended gameplay they've shown, but clearly there is still more problems. The fact that they are still hiring means that people have likely been leaving, especially after the game got sort of shown off, and, a supposed announcement date of like March 2025 being the release date. People probably saw the progress, got upset, and some people likely left, and that's why there's still Ken Levine's, announcing that they're hiring people. Now, what does this really mean for us, I guess? Judas likely isn't releasing anytime this year. We might see something probably at the, Game of Year Awards, since the game was initially shown there a couple of years ago, and they might show off more of the game. But the chances are the game will probably come out next year, hopefully, I guess is the best way to say it. Now, as for the actual game itself, I guess they've kind of learned from their mistakes of not showing too much of the game, I guess. In theory, what they've shown is really hard to kind of backtrack and then remake, but we did see that with the 2010 gameplay. A lot of people point to that for BioShock Infinite, how the final game looks nothing like that, which I kind of agree with. I think there's a lot of elements in the 2010 that made it into the final game, but not exactly how they were when they were initially shown. So just expect some of what you've seen to probably be massively changed and look a little bit different, because that's just kind of how Ken Levine games are. So between eventually waiting on Judas and I guess they're restructuring the entirety of the team working on BioShock 4, we probably are going to be in a big content drought between the two games for a long time. Oh yeah, they also canceled the BioShock remake, which I think was probably also a good idea. But yeah, hopefully we get more news about Judas soon.